Alrighty then. Good evening, everybody. How are we doing? I hope well. And as a prelude to my commentary, I guess you could say, on tonight's ruling handed down by the Supreme Court, I want to just note that over the past 4+ years now, I have generated a not insubstantial following on Twitter, on YouTube, on other platforms that is composed of uh, Trump supporters, MAGA, faithful, conservative, center right, libertarian, etc. The whole gamut, in addition to other quote unquote followers who are on the left, socialist, Democrat, what have you. But there's no doubt that a significant portion of the followers accrued over these past 4 years have definitely been Trump supporters in one way or another, or even if they're not outright Trump supporters, they are Trump curious, or they have disdain for the ways in which Trump has been maligned by the media and by Democrats, and so they follow me whatever their exact rationale, which is good, which is something I've always appreciated. I've always wanted to explicitly engage with the widest possible variety of perspectives across the ideological spectrum. I think it's a danger, and it's corrupting, and it's boring when all you do is get yourself siloed into a very narrowly confined spectrum of opinion that just tends to then be reinforcing of your biases and doesn't lend itself to any real fruitful dialogue or debate. So I appreciate that. I've always have. But when you look out on the especially online conservative media world, clearly there are actors within that world, to put it charitably, in calling them actors. And I say actors as sort of like a neutral designation. You could call them actors in the theatrical sense as well, potentially. But nonetheless, there are persons and entities within that world who've correctly divined that it is viable for them from a profit perspective, from an online engagement perspective, from a stature and influence perspective, to simply feed Trump supporters or the Trump curious or whomever exactly what it is that they want to hear. Facts be damned, logic be damned, reason be damned. And that has really kicked into overdrive since the election on November 3rd. I and others who, in general, have a good faith predisposition to interface rationally and respectfully with people with whom I don't necessarily agree, especially on candidate preference. I didn't vote for Trump in 2016, didn't vote for him in 2020. I've been critical of him on a whole slew of issues, even as I, let's say, defend him when the facts merit, such as Russiagate. That would be by far the most high profile example of where I departed radically, you might say, with the mainstream consensus in terms of Trump's alleged malfeasance. But since election day, it's just been a tsunami of BS intended to prey upon the passions, upon the anxieties, upon the discontent, upon the emotions of Trump supporters. And the people doing so are by and large charlatans. Whether that's in the online media world, and I'm not going to name names, it's not worth getting into feuds or spats or drama. That's not really what I'm interested in. You can, I'm sure, use your own judgment to figure out some specific examples. Or whether it's these legal, lawyerly supposed con artists who have just been spewing nonsense nonstop, day after day, for 5 weeks. And it culminated with this lawsuit that was filed by Texas a few days ago at the Supreme Court. This was supposed to be the big enchilada. This was supposed to be the dramatic conclusion to all the litigation efforts that have been mounted by Trump's campaign and by Trump supporters at various levels of the judicial system. It was all supposed to climax tonight when the Supreme Court was foretold to suddenly decide, in contravention of all possibly feasible precedent, they were going to suddenly have a revelation and take it upon themselves to intrude so dramatically in the presidential election process that they were going to direct 4 states, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, to vacate their election results. And they were going to order those states to instead set about allocating their electoral college appointments in an entirely different manner than they had previously chosen to do so by statute. That was an extreme proposition. Extreme from a whole number of standpoints. Definitely extreme from a standpoint of federalism. And that's not to say that I am necessarily some kind of staunch, principled proponent of federalism. And federalism itself is up for much dispute as to what it exactly implies for any number of potentially contested issues. But if you're at all familiar with the core tenets of federalism, the idea that Texas, joined by a few other states, just as a side note, Texas initiated the lawsuit, then 17 other states, quote unquote, supported that lawsuit by filing a supportive brief, and then a smaller number of states actually attempted to join the motion. So it's a little bit of an arcane distinction, but for simplicity, I'm just going to use Texas as the stand-in. The idea that Texas could claim that it was harmed by the manner in which Pennsylvania opted to conduct its election. And the idea that that harm, according to Texas, stemmed, at least in part, from Pennsylvania violating its own state law. And as relief, Texas would demand that the Supreme Court, by judicial fiat, negate the election outcome in Pennsylvania, on top of the 3 other states. The idea that that remedy could be remotely congruous with any recognizable standard of federalism is so far beyond the bounds of credulity that it's a little hard to even fathom. And yet, you had a great number of Republican attorneys general signing on to this. You had 120 plus, I think, Republican members of the House of Representatives signing on to this. And naturally, you had huge sections of the conservative media signing on to this. And what is the end result? Well, nothing in terms of actual tangible action, because it was dismissed, in effect, summarily by the Supreme Court tonight, unanimously. Now, it's a little bit tricky as to whether you can conclusively call it a unanimous ruling, because when you have an unsigned decision like this, it's kind of up for debate as to whether that can be said to reflect unanimity. And you did have Thomas and Alito issuing kind of like a separate statement appended to the decision, clarifying that they believe the Supreme Court is mandated to hear all cases that invoke original jurisdiction, meaning disputes between the states, because there's no, they're the sole court to which those grievances can be filed. But even Thomas and Alito said that they would not grant the relief sought, and they offered no opinion on any of the other issues raised in the lawsuit. So it's a flat, more or less, rejection. And of course, contributing to that rejection were 3 Supreme Court justices appointed by Donald Trump, including Amy Coney Barrett, who it was speculated wildly by her opponents and some of her supporters that she would just corruptly maneuver to deliver the election somehow to Trump as payback for him appointing her shortly before the election. And that was always a fantasy. So much of all of this is like utterly fantastical and divorced from reality. And that was obvious. It was obvious that this would be the result of all litigation post-election, up to and including the Supreme Court decision. And the Supreme Court decision, as far-fetched as it was probably the best chance of actually attaining some remedial action on behalf of Trump that would change the outcome of the election. And the odds of that prevailing were like 0.001% as opposed to 0%. And 0% applies to all the Kraken, Sidney Powell Linwood nonsense, which succeeded only in getting a whole ton of contributions flowing into the coffers of Sidney Powell and Linwood. And also the Stop the Steal geniuses who love to promote their various activities on social media and solicit donations from, again, people who they are just manipulating. And that I find to be pathetic and sad and actually condemnable. You may not always agree with me. You may not always like everything I do. Maybe you like some things, maybe you don't like others. Whatever the case may be, I'd like to believe that you can have at least some assurance that I'm never just trying to manipulate you or deceive you or, milk you for everything you're worth because it will benefit me. That really is a corrupt mentality, but it's so prevalent right now, particularly on the online right-wing world. Now, you don't have to tell me that there's an antecedent to this on the left liberal world. Believe me, I know. I spent 4 years pointing it out. I contemporaneously collected examples of prominent liberal left figures almost exactly 4 years ago to the day trying to whip up a scheme to subvert the Electoral College and block Trump from ascending to power on the basis of Russia conspiracy. So I don't need to be told that there are potential parallels here to what has occurred in the past. I would suggest that I actually was one of the foremost chroniclers of that, but that doesn't mean that I suddenly become some kind of lobotomized stooge and hop on the bandwagon of a plainly farcical crusade like this always was. I don't like when manipulation and deception and dishonesty and corruption occurs anywhere across the political spectrum. Maybe it's something visceral in me that I react so negatively to it. And I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but that's the guiding sort of impulse that I apply whenever I happen upon it, regardless of whose interests are benefited by the scam. This time it happened to be Trump, Republicans, whoever. Last time it was liberals, Democrats, etc. And so if you do happen to be a right-wing follower, all I would ask you to do is reflect on the sources of information that you consume from. If they had strung you along for these past 5 weeks, if they had tried to emotionally titillate you by telling you that there was always some blockbuster plot twist around the corner, it would culminate in this incredible climax of the Supreme Court. If they had told you it was a slam dunk, if they told you that Release the Kraken was a real thing, or that Sidney Powell knew what the hell she was doing, or that she wasn't a deluded, basically, scammer. If they told you that that Rudy Giuliani was a sound choice to lead a post-election legal effort, if they told you anything which kind of formed the basis of this scintillating post-election narrative, then either they were too dumb or deluded or crippled by confirmation bias to be capable of giving you a truthful rendering of what's actually happened, or they were actively and cynically manipulating you for whatever reason, whether it's views, clicks, contributions, social media follows, engagement, whatever. Either way, it's not a good explanation. So that is something that I would encourage you to at least try to reflect on and know that there are people who are intent on feeding you false or faulty information. And that's not something that I will ever abide. I'm sort of constitutionally incapable of doing that. And sometimes it angers people. It angered a lot of people over the course of the Trump presidency vis-a-vis Russia and all kinds of other phony moral panics that were cravenly employed to target Trump on wholly irrational grounds, and it applies now in a parallel sense to Trump supporters or conservatives or whoever being upset that I didn't just feed them exactly what they wanted to hear with regard to this election fraud stuff. And I don't now, and I never 100% discounted that it's plausible or possible you can find select incidences of election fraud, but you know where the best place to actually test claims of election fraud probably is? It would be the federal or state court system. And so many of those claims were tested and thrown out. And so many of the narratives which stemmed from these election fraud theories were just almost insultingly wrong. And you can ascertain that by just doing basic empirical inquiry. Like I had a article in the New York Daily News in the newspaper last Sunday, and it was in response, or it was kind of impelled by this claim constantly circulating everywhere you look on the internet that only these 4 key swing states, only in the 4 metropolitan areas or cities, I mean, the claims kind of differ depending who you ask, but only in the Detroit metropolitan area or Detroit itself, the Milwaukee metropolitan area or Milwaukee itself, the Philadelphia metropolitan area or Philadelphia itself, or the Atlanta metropolitan area or Atlanta itself, did Biden overperform Hillary Clinton, which was supposed to suggest a concerted targeted fraud scheme, but the claim just didn't hold up by any conceivable empirical metric. Biden did not only overperform Clinton in those 4 metropolitan areas. I could give you probably 25 or 30 additional metropolitan areas around the country where Biden overperformed Clinton. I'll just name a few here: Dallas, Houston, Denver, Jacksonville, Anchorage, Boston, Washington, D.C., Seattle. Those are just metropolitan areas. Then if you get into cities, Biden underperformed Clinton by percentage in Philadelphia. He netted fewer votes out of the city of Philadelphia than Clinton netted. And in Milwaukee, he only netted 3,000 more votes than Clinton, which was actually, you could say, an underperformance given the amount of emphasis the Democrats tried to place on generating turnout in Milwaukee. The reason for Biden's win in those states was not due to some drastic, suspicious overperformance in the urban centers or in the urban centers. It was due to his genuine overperformance in the suburban areas. So if you want to focus on fraud in Michigan, for example, look at Kent County or Grand Rapids, where I actually lived for a while, and know that county shifted Democratic. And it's a traditionally Republican county. That's where Justin Amash represents, who left the Republican Party. But nonetheless, he was elected as a Republican. That shifted Democratic. There are so many other examples like this that just defy any and all reason, that it really should cause you to linger on the fact that you were being misled. You're being sold just BS. And I would think you would not appreciate being sold BS, even if it's BS that happens to flatter your partisan or tribal biases, because that's just a dead end. And so now it's the end of the road. The Supreme Court has weighed in. The Electoral College formally meets on Monday. I don't know what the next option now is for Trump, other beyond, I don't know, a military coup. And I don't think there's a whole lot of people in the military who are actually interested in carrying out such a coup, and it's a preposterous idea to begin with. And it's not that it necessarily undermines only Trump. I mean, there are plenty of liberal hysterics who thought that this supposed coup would be so much more efficacious than it clearly was. I mean, it's been inept. It's been almost like a sideshow. It's been just a comedy of errors. And to have called it a legitimate coup is total absurdity. All right, everybody, that'll do it for now. As always, stay safe, stay cool. Bye bye.